Dr. Tan Boon Meng.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the ministers for their ministerial statements. I have 2 questions and 1 suggestion. Sir, many of my Clementi residents were very worried to hear about what happened. And it's important that MAS has recognized that there needs to be equitable sharing of losses when an incident happens. My first question is, will this proposed equitable sharing look at the difference between an unforced error as compared to a forced error, where a customer was led or pressured into making an error, as appears to have been the case with the OCBC phishing scam? The second question, Mr. Speaker, is will this proposed framework for equitable sharing of losses also consider the speed of the bank response when a consumer is trying to get help? One of my Clementi residents described it as thus. He said, imagine you got tricked. Someone copied your house keys. They're looting your house now. You call for help and you're put on hold. Wait to press a number or get to the right department. That's what my residents said. And they're worried what happens if this is their experience in a scam. Sir, for the suggestion, may I suggest to the ministries that if not already done so, there can be red teams looking at not just fighting the last scam war, but the next one. Because today we know there are deep fakes for voices, deep fakes for video calls. As the technology improves, we have to be ready for the next character of scam. And likewise, is there a role for white hat scammers, just like there are white hat hackers, white hat scammers actively testing the bank's procedures to look for vulnerabilities before fellow Singaporeans suffer avoidable losses? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I thank Dr. Tan for his suggestion on the last point. Indeed, we cannot be fighting the last war. We have to look ahead, anticipate vulnerabilities, and continually look at different ways to improve our system. And MAS is certainly committed to this process. On the framework for the sharing of losses incurred by customers, this is a complex issue. I mentioned just now that it's being deliberated upon at the Payments Council, which is chaired by the MAS, and it aims to put out something for public consultation within the next 3 months. I do not want to get ahead of the process, but I would just want to set out some key principles which the Council is using to guide its deliberations. First, the framework for the sharing of losses should be consistent and common. So it shouldn't matter which bank you go to. It has to be applied consistently across the entire industry. Second, the framework should be equitable in determining how losses are to be shared, because both banks and customers have their respective responsibilities. So Dr. Tan talked about some scenarios about speed, about whether or not it's a forced or unforced error. But what we intend to do is to be quite specific, quite clear and specific about what these responsibilities are for financial institutions and for customers, and what each party is expected to do to prevent scams. Then the share of losses each party bears will depend on whether or how the party has fallen short of these very clearly stated responsibilities. I think that's a fair and equitable principle, but obviously there are many details to be worked out. And so the Payments Council chaired by MAS will go about these deliberations with the different stakeholders. And I should add, the stakeholders, as I mentioned earlier, also include players operating the communications infrastructure, because we want to ensure that there is proper accountability across the entire ecosystem. Thank you, sir.
Ms. Fumiha. Thank you, Speaker. I thank the ministers for their comprehensive replies. I agree with the minister that we need to adopt an ecosystem approach to tackle banking scams. I have two supplementary questions for the Minister for Finance. First question, given the unprecedented wave of online banking frauds hitting consumers, actually not just in Singapore, we read about accounts in UK and around the world, I want to ask, how does MAS fare in terms of anti-scam controls as compared to some of the best practices in other jurisdictions to protect the interests of our consumers? So the second question relates back to the new framework being debated to establish how losses behind scams are to be shared between consumers and financial institutions. I want to ask specifically, would MAS be imposing a set of minimum standards for banks' fraud surveillance system to better protect consumers? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I thank Ms. Fu for a very important question. MAS approach and what MAS has done so far has in fact gone beyond the usual practices of among financial regulators. In major jurisdictions, regulators do not themselves prescribe the specific anti-scam controls for the banks. Instead, they take a supervisory approach, which means they set out the broad supervisory expectations of the banks. Then they place the responsibility on the banks to develop the specific anti-scam measures. And then the regulators will assess the adequacy of these measures, and they will impose penalties if the banks fall short of expectations. So that's the approach that other regulators take, most regulators will take, and that's also the basic approach that MAS has undertaken. But as I mentioned, as MAS has in fact gone beyond most regulators in being quite clear about its expectations as well as the specific anti-scam measures that are required. Amongst the 3 local banks, this started last year following from MAS's focused supervisory review. And then earlier this year in January, as I mentioned just now, MAS and ABS put in place a comprehensive suite of measures and controls that will apply across all retail banks. And that is, in fact, more than what major jurisdictions have in place. More than what major jurisdictions have in place. And we are going beyond that because, as I highlighted in my speech, MAS is also considering and studying further enhancements to the measures that we can put in place across banks to reduce the risk across our digital banking channels. So let me assure members that MAS takes this work very seriously. It has been and will continue to do everything it can, working together with other partners and stakeholders to strengthen the security across our digital banking channels and also across the entire digital ecosystem. On the second question, on the framework for the sharing of losses, as I don't want to get into details because, as I highlighted, this is still work in progress. But as I mentioned just now, our intention is to clearly set out basic responsibilities expected of financial institutions. And indeed, if financial institutions were to fall short of these responsibilities, then they should bear their share of the losses. So this is work in progress, and we will put out the details in due course when we are ready.
Mr. Gerald Giam.
So I have clarifications for the Minister for Communication and Information as well as Minister for Finance. For the Minister for Communications and Information, once the sender ID registry becomes a whitelist, like what she described just now, will scammers still be able to send SMSs from overseas with the sender ID that is not registered in Singapore's registry? And if so, how would such scam messages be prevented? Secondly, is there a fast-track channel in which scam websites can be reported even by members of the public and blocked expeditiously. For the Minister for Finance, recent scams have demonstrated that SMS is an insecure channel for sending either one-time passwords or hyperlinks. According to MAS's Technology Risk Assessment Guidelines to financial institutions, end-to-end encryption should be implemented for the transmission of customer passwords. SMS is not an end-to-end encrypted channel, so why isn't MAS immediately prohibiting the use of SMS one-time passwords, especially to protect the less tech-savvy customers who are at risk of getting scammed? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I don't mean to be too technical, but I think to answer the member's question, I have to explain how the SMS service providers will interact with the SMS Sender ID registry. Basically, the SMS service providers will be approached by a party to say that here is a message that I would like to send to these numbers in Singapore. Now, the imposition that we are making on the SMS service provider is to look at the header that is being requested by the customer to send it under and check it against the registry. So if a name already appears on the registry, then regardless of who the customer is or where they are requesting this service from, as long as the name appears in the registry and this party's details do not match the other records in the registry in terms of their UEN, in terms of the path that they describe, how they want to send the SMS across, then this business has to be turned away by the SMS service providers. So the purpose of having the registry is to allow the SMS service providers to know whether this is a legitimate request. And if these signs of a legitimate request are not met, the requirement for the SMS service provider is to turn away the business. So I hope that provides an answer to his question.
Mr. Speaker, on the use of SMS to deliver OTPs, I mentioned just now that we are reviewing this practice and whether or not that if we were to continue, whether potential measures should be taken to reduce the risk. I should highlight that really, as I mentioned in my speech, there is no single measure that can guarantee the security of digital banking. Issuance of SMS, if it were to be done through a very safe and encrypted channel, for example, that would not stop deception from happening. And if the scam succeeds in identity theft, as has happened here, impersonating a bank, getting the person to think that this is in fact a genuine bank, then the person with the OTP will still provide the OTP to this scammed website or scammed account or whatever it is. So it is a broader issue that we have to look at holistically. And as I mentioned, we are determined and we are committed to this process to review the entire ecosystem and to strengthen it.
Mr. Dornby.
Mr. Speaker, sir, in Mandarin, 我想咨询陈国民部长。随着冠病疫情期间网上诈骗的急剧增加，导致金融机构尽量减少面对面交易，警方是否会加强与新加坡数码转型办公室和关怀乐龄办事处 SGO 的合作和教育工作，以接触和帮助年长者？例如，通过建立更多在祖屋区的新加坡数码转型社区援助站，和派出更多关怀大使走访年长者住家。我想阿公阿嬷很难理解 Scam Shield 的实际运作功能。谢谢。
Mr. Speaker, I will answer in English and I'll say a few remarks in Mandarin. Thank the member for the question. Actually, Mr. Josephine has highlighted many of the measures that we have implemented in relation to helping our seniors go digital, as well as to continue in our digital transformation journey. I think the question is a valid one in relation to how this incident may have affected some confidence, especially among our users and among our seniors. I want to emphasize that, as I mentioned in my speech earlier on, the groups of people who are affected by scams are not just the seniors. In fact, our data showed that the younger people who have been transacting more online are more susceptible or just as susceptible to scams. So I think there are two areas that we need to focus on in relation to members' question. One is how can we bolster confidence among our users? And that's something that Minister Lawrence, Minister Josephine, and myself have been trying to explain and let the members know the measures that we are taking to make the digital space a safer environment for all of us to operate in. And the second one is to build a more resilient community in the use of the digital space. And that's something that we have been working with the different stakeholders and partners, government, as well as private sector to strengthen. Now, specific to MP's question, Don Wee's question, on the seniors program, we have introduced a number of programs, and given this incident, we will continue to step up our outreach to our seniors to not just help them to acquire the skill sets, but also to explain to them what are the telltale signs of scams and how to protect themselves from the scams. To date, the SDOs have done a great job in reaching out to 130,000 seniors in our community at the community centers, at different libraries, and so on. So we will continue to step up these efforts. And I want to end off by saying that this education effort is an important one. We want to build a smart nation. We also want to build a scam-smart nation, where our people understand the telltale signs and can protect themselves and help each other. 议长先生，在近年里，我国诈骗案件已经日益增加，因此内政部和不同的政府部门呢，会全力以赴和社区伙伴尽我们的全力来加强诈骗防范，而且提高我们国人对防范的意识的诈骗的意识。在2021年呢，网络的钓鱼诈骗案有逐渐的增加，诈骗集团运用各种方式来欺骗我们消费者，受害者上当，也引诱他们投入他们本身自己的资料。所以在这里呢，我想呼吁大家一定要提高警惕，不要轻易相信陌生人，更不要把你私人的资料传给别人，或是转账汇款。公众也可以到 Apple Store 下载 Scam Shield。黄议员说了，我们的阿公阿嬷不太了解 Scam Shield， 其实我相信我们的阿公阿嬷会了解 Scam Shield 的应用利益呢，他们就会更能够保护他们，让他们能够更有信心的运用数码的平台。谢谢。
Ms. Hazelpo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the ministers and the ministries for the efforts that they have put in and continue to put in to prevent future scams. I have two supplementary questions. Firstly, is MAS considering the contingency reimbursement model in UK, where banks reimburse scam victims, which started on a voluntary basis, but there are now plans to legislate it? Second supplementary question. In working out the shared responsibility between the banks and their customers, would MAS consider putting the onus more on the banks on the basis that, one, the banks are more tech savvy and scam savvy than the average bank customer, and they have better resources to keep up to date with the latest tactics? Two, it provides additional incentives on the banks to adopt a preemptive approach, for example, to consider the scam potential before pushing out new procedures or facilities. And thirdly, it is probably more cost-effective to focus scam prevention efforts from the ends of a few banks rather than public education on a whole wide range of bank customers. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, this must be my third question on the loss sharing framework. I can appreciate that there's a lot of interest in this. And as I said, it's work in progress, but to quickly answer Ms. Pua's two questions. Number one, MAS will certainly look at models around the world in developing the details of this framework for the sharing of losses in an equitable fashion. Number two, as she highlighted, the responsibilities will be different for individuals and financial institutions. We are very mindful that individuals have a different set of resources and capabilities compared to financial institutions. So in developing the specific responsibilities for individuals and for financial institutions, we will certainly take that into consideration.
Mr. Vikram Nair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have one clarification for the Senior Minister of State for Home Affairs. Now, one of the issues with scams is the perpetrators are normally based abroad, and I just want to check whether there's any framework in place for us to actually cooperate with foreign agencies in order to identify the perpetrators and have them prosecuted for these actions. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I mentioned in my speech that this is an area that MHA and SPF will continue to sharpen and to build our networks across the different foreign law enforcement agencies, as well as working with Interpol to enhance our ability to respond and to investigate cross-jurisdiction. At the same time, I also mentioned some of the difficulties, including how we can get our foreign law enforcement agency partners to work within their jurisdiction, and also that since once the money has been transferred, there are also some difficulties as well. But it's an effort that we'll continue to do as we have done in recent times, and we will step up this collaboration with the partners, foreign law enforcement agencies, to try and strengthen our enforcement as well as recovery of lost monies with the foreign banks as well. Thank you.
Associate Professor James Lim.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have two questions. The first, for Minister Wong, I wonder if the ministry has plans to introduce complementary legislation to bolster the additional regulatory actions that he has already proposed. And the reason is because while regulation is often useful for guiding actions, to use the example Minister Wong raised earlier about allowing certain transactions to be disputed, without the force of law, it might still fail to adequately ensure an equal distribution of liability, even in the presence of, as he described, the equitable framework. Using the same example, if I may, requiring charges above $50 to be subject to dispute under the Fair Credit Billing Act in the US has meant that financial institutions have actually been a lot more proactive in deploying fraud detection systems and securing fraud insurance. This is something that Member Hazel Pua has mentioned as well. My second question is for Minister Teo, and it is to ask if there are plans to comprehensively audit the compliance of technology systems with their official safeguards. I say this because in a recent little experiment with my Sengkang colleague, Louis Chua, we tried to test the limits of the Pay Now system as applied by banks. The stated Pay Now transfer limit in the absence of additional authentication via a token is meant to be $1,000. However, we were able to transfer sums in excess of this amount just by instantaneously changing the daily transfer limits. And again, without any two-factor authentication beyond the PIN prior to executing the transfer. Others have reported similar lapses in banks' checks and balances in guaranteeing customer security. One banking customer writing to the Straits Times shares that they were able to breach their credit limit by 1.8 times in transactions occurring over multiple countries in foreign currencies without the incident being flagged.
Mr. Speaker, in developing any new measures, MAS will want to ensure that these new measures are effective in reducing the risk in our banking system, effective in implementation. And if legislative changes are necessary, if new legislation is necessary or amendments to the laws are necessary, we will certainly not rule out those options.
Mr. Speaker, there are two parts to the member's question. One is, in terms of the bank's information systems, IT systems, we classify them as part of our critical information infrastructure, and as a result of this classification, they are subject to higher requirements and also regular audits. So earlier on, when I had explained, and Minister Wong had also explained why this was not a cyber attack, a cyber security breach, that has to do with the kind of defenses that are part of the banking system being critical information infrastructure. Is it subject to regular audits? It has to be. Otherwise, we wouldn't know whether the cyber defenses that are intended to be put up are in fact effectively done so. So that part is done. But I would always caution that this is not something you brag about. Just because the system is sound at any point in time doesn't mean that it is not continuously being subject to testing. And whether it is banks, whether it is our telcos, as part of the operators of our critical information infrastructure, they always also have to conduct their own penetration testing in order to assure themselves that there are no vulnerabilities or gaps that are glaring and that have not been patched. So that's one part of it. The second part of it, and his experiment with Mr. Chua using PayNow, I think is very similar to what Dr. Tan Wu Ming had already suggested earlier, is that would you consider subjecting your own banking processes to white hat scammers? And I think Minister Wong had already responded to that question to say that the answer is yes, it's a good suggestion. And we should be seriously thinking about how to do so.
Sang Wei Nang.
Thank you, Speaker. I thank the ministers and MOS for the comprehensive reply. I would like to ask a couple of supplementary questions. We understand from MOS Desmond that once the money is transferred out of Singapore during the internet scam, it's almost as good as gone. So I would like to ask Minister of Finance, what is the proportion of the internet transfer involving the account overseas? Is it possible for the local user to opt for, by default, don't allow transfer of money out overseas unless authorized otherwise, have a two-step verifications. This is similar to what a local mobile phone user, they can then disable the auto roaming, so to minimize the cost itself. And secondly, when banks are alerted of significant increase in banking scam, can the banks deactivate all overseas bank transfer for the short period, so to minimize the scam impact? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, the short answer is to both questions are yes, because as I mentioned in my speech, MAS is indeed looking to introduce additional customer confirmations for higher risk transactions. And that would include fund transfers that are large relative to their overall balances, as well as overseas transfers, recognizing that once the funds leave our local banking system, they are very hard to recover indeed. So, as I mentioned, this is an additional strengthening and enhancements we are looking at, which will require customer confirmation. It will add friction to the transaction for genuine customers, but we hope that everyone understands that these inconveniences are necessary to have a safer digital banking system in Singapore. The second point about having a cooling period, indeed, that's something, if the banks are aware of a scam and whether or not they can put in place some cooling off periods, indeed, that's something that has been done, and we'll continue to look at how these sort of measures and safeguards can be strengthened.
Ms. Yuan Ling.
Thank you, Ministers, for the comprehensive reply. I would like to ask a follow-up question from the Honourable Members Ms. Foo Mi Ha's question on anti-scam standards set by the Ministry of Finance. My residents who came to me to seek help on the recent OCBC bank scam incident shared that information from the bank during the investigation process and the support during the process itself was left wanting. Many of them had interactions only with the call center staff, and this have left them very afraid and stressed and indeed worried that their life savings were kept in limbo. So I would like to ask if the ministry or the agencies in charge of this will be putting in standards and requirements to the banks in the management of scam victims during the investigation process.
Mr. Speaker, again, the short answer is yes, but I should clarify the standards are not set by the Ministry of Finance. They are set by the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and I'm speaking also in my capacity as the Deputy Chairman of the MAS. This is under MAS's purview. As I explained in my speech just now, we've assessed that OCBC itself in this incident could have done better. There were areas in terms of its responses to customers which certainly could be improved, and that's why we are reviewing the conduct of OCBC, and we will take the appropriate actions. That's for the OCBC incident. But with regard to standards, expectations, responsibilities, these are in place today for all the retail banks, and we will continue to review and ensure that these standards are set in such a way that provides assurances to customers and hold the banks accountable to meeting these high standards.
It's Melvin Yong.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is sobering to learn that our current anti-scam systems are blocking millions of scam calls each month. I'd like to ask Minister Josephine Teo whether this useful protective filter extends to blocking scam calls made using voice over internet protocol, which allows calls to be made over the internet, as well as telecommunications applications such as WhatsApp call, which is also becoming very popular even among our seniors. And if not, are there any plans by the ministry to safeguard these channels?
Mr. Speaker, as a general point, we are constantly looking at what channels are being exploited for scams to be perpetrated. But he is right. The current call blocking, as well as the website blocking, is now mainly done through DNS blocking. So unless my technical understanding is flawed, and I would have to check this up, my understanding that it does not block voice over IP calls. So, but I would have to get back to him properly. Thank you.